Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Putting a Story in History. Today, I wanted to talk about something that's been happening in the United States as of late that is pretty disturbing, and I figured it was worth a video. So, what we're going to talk about today are the string of violent attacks against elderly Asian men and women in the United States, and kind of the reasoning, or not the reasoning, I guess, but like why all of a sudden this is something that's happening. Um, Now, for those of you who know anything about racism, right, it's been around in the United States for a long time. It's not anything new or different. But specifically, anti-Asian racism in the United States is something that we don't talk about as much because we often talk about racism when we talk about African Americans. So today we're going to talk about kind of the history of anti-Asian racism in America and where it's coming from. And hopefully you learn something about this and get something out of it. So to start, like I said, right, racism and xenophobia have always been a part of the United States. Our systems of government are founded on those principles of xenophobia and racism. But for a while, it was just kind of utilized on black people. But as America grew and we got to the West Coast and we started getting immigrants from other places, that xenophobia and racism has been extended to other groups. And that really started with the Chinese Exclusion Act. Where that came from was there were kind of a series of natural disasters and then the Opium Wars that happened in China. And these peasants who had been living in China their entire lives for generations, right, they ended up coming across the ocean in search for a better life, much like most immigrants do coming to the United States. And so when they came to America, right, racism against these people ended up becoming on the rise because they blamed the Chinese on the bad economic impacts on their own lives, right? They were having trouble finding jobs. There were very low wages. The same things that we blame white Americans blame Mexicans for today. They use the same thing against the Chinese. And now that's not necessarily the Chinese people's fault. It was more or less the people who are deciding to pay people that little that was making that kind of thing happen. But anyway, because the people of the West were complaining so much, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and it was basically the first law that specifically restricted immigration into the United States. And the stated purpose of the law at the time was to basically satiate the workers out West while also attempting to maintain white purity in America, right? Like I said, right, white government, American government is founded on these principles of xenophobia and racism, so they are trying to maintain that through congressional authority. Now, despite that, right, there's still hundreds and thousands of Chinese people living in the United States now. They had already immigrated here, and they were still allowing some to come, but not a lot. And so these Chinese immigrants ended up becoming prime candidates for helping build our national railway. The Transcontinental Railroad was going to go all the way from California to the East Coast. And as people were working from the east to the west, the people working from the west to the east were mostly white foremen and these Chinese immigrants who were the ones building this railroad. And so they were widely used in the incredibly dangerous and deadly jobs on purpose. So they were the ones who would run dynamite into the caves when they were trying to build tunnels, or they were the ones who would be forced to move large rocks off of where they were trying to go and stuff like that. These jobs were specifically given to these Chinese people because they were viewed as expendable instead of as human beings. If we want to fast forward a little bit, all the way up till World War II, I'm sure I've missed a lot of different instances in between, the 1880s and World War II, but only so much research could be done. In World War II, after Japan attacked the United States, President Roosevelt ordered the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So anybody that was living on the West Coast that was of Japanese descent was forced to move inland to these basically concentration camps in the American West, Southwest. and their property was seized and stolen and given to white people instead of back to them when they were allowed to return. So basically everything that they had was stolen from them, which was not great. McCarthyism came right after that, right? World War II, communism was rising as a global force. China fell to communism, and it played into these fears that, anybody who was Russian or anybody who was Chinese, or these sleeper agents who've come to spread communism to America. And so this really kind of stoked this anti-Asian sentiment, not just of Chinese people, but any Asian person in the United States, because they are all seeming to be lumped together. They weren't differentiated because there are many different types of Asian people. So all these people now were being targeted for being communists, and that was due to McCarthy and his fear-mongering, which made this problem even worse in modern America. Now, meanwhile, while all this is happening, Hollywood is also becoming a big part of American culture, and film is the medium in which cultural trends are formed. And so during this time, all these films that are now being played to a mass audience kind of had this power to create these cultural connections and stereotypes about certain types of people. And so there have been lots of different stereotypes that have been created in the film industry about Asian people over the years, and those include the model minority myth that Asians don't experience the troubles that immigrants do when they come to America because they're a model minority. They blend in and they become American really fast. The English accent, when they talk like this, right? That accent, which is super offensive, right, was created by Hollywood. Asians are always typecast into these mysterious or menacing villain roles. The use of yellowface, much like blackface, was very prominent in the early part of Hollywood. And young Asian characters are always either nerds, knowing everything and easily looked down upon, or they're martial arts masters. And it's kind of mysterious how these 14-year-olds know extreme martial arts. So these stereotypes have kind of hampered Asian representation in the United States, just like the stereotypes that hamper Black representation or Native American representation in the United States as well. And now finally, in recent years, there have been two major factors that have kind of spurred on this anti-Asian sentiment. First being China's growth as a world power and its economic might. People are pointing to China as the place that's ruining American manufacturing and ruining American jobs. But in reality, it's the companies that are sending the jobs there in the first place instead of trying to keep them in America that are ruining this. It's not China's fault that, or the people of China's fault that their country allows them to be paid less to do work that Americans could be doing at home, right? But China has been blamed for this sort of thing. And the same thing is with this COVID-19 pandemic, right? COVID originated in Wuhan, China, and it's becoming a reason to scapegoat Asian people and blame our problems on them. And that's not right. It's not people who are already here's fault that a virus started or originated in China. It's not even China's fault that the virus originated in China. So all these different factors have led to this anti-Asian sentiment, which has always really been there. People are seeming to act like it's something new that's just started to happen in recent weeks, but the sentiment and the history behind it prove otherwise, right? There's always been this history of racism against Asian people in the United States. So knowing that, moving forward, we need to not just push for equity amongst Black and white Americans. We need to push for equity for Asian Americans. We need to push for equity for all minorities, because the movement for equity shouldn't be just about one group. It should be about everybody having the same level of equality and freedom, and that's what America should be about, even though it hasn't been since its inception. Thank you so much for watching yet another episode of Putting the Story in History. I'm very happy to keep making these videos and informing you about all sorts of historical things. If you have any suggestions about what you would like me to talk about or things that you think would make a great story about history, go ahead and drop a comment in the comment section, and I'll take a look and I'll see what I can do. Thank you once again so much for watching. See you soon for more Putting the Story in History.